so much for coming, and thank you so much to those of you who've read the novel. I'm so honored. And what would you, now should I just read?
You know, I think so.
Okay, all right. So, and how long would you like me to read for?
You know,
till page 400.
Yeah.
Oh, okay, no worries.
Just
No, I'm a speed reader. I'll get there in 20 minutes.
Yeah, just breeze through it.
Right. I'll just leave you. I'll leave all but the last chapter and send you home on a cliffhanger.
Exactly.
Well, for those of you who haven't read it yet. Not that you ever have to. You know, it's enough that you're here tonight. So you want me to just stand here? Wow, I love it. It's so retro. I feel like Billie Holiday. I'll stop. Okay. Yes, and pardon my slight tardiness. I really thought that 1 p.m. was early enough to schedule the drop-off of an old car and the buying of a new old, but not as old car in Jackson Heights. But, you know, as one should learn the lesson by now at this stage in my life, that things always take longer than, you know, so. And since the old car literally died as I pulled it into the lot to get the new car, I was really held hostage to the situation. I couldn't just get in the old car and be like, I can't do this now. So it was quite tense. But I drove here in the new car.
What is it?
It's a 2008 Honda CR-V, and I love it. Can I tell you? I love it. It's my dream car, which, you know, I have a pretty low threshold for glamour. So, because, you know, I feel like, you know, a Kardashian in that thing. So, alrighty, well, I will read, I'll read a chapter that I love to read, and, you know, for those of you, I know some have read it and some haven't, you know, so I will just say that, you know, for those who haven't, Christodora is, you know, obviously it's named for the actual Christodora building right here in this neighborhood, a very historic building that saw, I don't know, this is like a,
There's a stool, I think.
Yeah.
There's a bigger one.
There's a taller stool behind.
Oh, there's a taller stool. Oh, okay. I actually played the piano too, so I could throw a little of that in too and really get real bang for your buck, or just for your time, really, since this is not a ticketed event, right? Okay. You know, so the novel is set. You know, it goes back and forth in time, but it starts the weekend before 9/11. And you know, a rather affluent young bohemian couple, Millie and Jared, who live in the Christodora, have in recent years they've adopted a little boy named Mateo, who is an AIDS orphan, whose mother, Isabel, died of AIDS in the very early 90s, and only 11 months after he was born. So, you know, by a series of events, they fostered him and then they adopted him, and so they are raising him, and that's when the book starts, and you know, he's quite young. And then the book goes forward in time, and it's about what happens to him and what happens to their family. But it also goes back in time, and it's about what happened to his mother and what happened to New York in the era of AIDS, of the high, oh, that's perfect. Thank you so much. It goes back as far as 1981, which, you know, some of you may know was the year that AIDS was sort of identified as something that looked like the beginning of an epidemic. It was identified by scientists and researchers. And Isabel is a young Latina from Queens who, you know, finds out that, well, you know what, actually, I'm actually going to read the chapter where she comes in for the first time. And, gets a little steamy, so I'm just going to warn you all. Those of you who read it know, right? But it's not the steamiest. Don't worry, I'm reading. I would say that it's an R, maybe not an NC-17 chapter. So this chapter is called "I Want to Thank You," and it's set in 1984. And here we go. Isabel was having so much fun. The music sounded amazing, and the men around her were beautiful. Whatever she and Tavi had taken. MDMA, she thought Tavi had said, had made her feel euphoric, and she and Tavi were dancing close, bumping, grinding. In the song, the woman sang something like, had enough of all the pressure, had a life that felt like pouring rain. Then I turned around. I was so astounded by your smile. Finally there was light, and this is the moment of my life. That's just how Issy felt. There could not be more than a few dozen other women in this packed club going on 2 a.m., and she knew none of these men were going to fall in love with her. But she didn't care. She was with her best friend, Tavi, and a bunch of Tavi's friends. The music was great, Tavi was holding her close, it was a Saturday night, and she didn't have to be back at work, in fact, until Thursday, the day after the 4th of July. She and Tavi locked eyes, held that stare, smiled. Then Tavi kissed her. Not his. Can you all hear in the back? Is the amplification okay? Okay. Okay. Not his usual kiss on the cheek, but on the lips, open-mouthed. Not with his tongue, but still, it lingered. She put her hand over her lips. "Oh my God, Tavi," she said. "You did not just." Tavi laughed like a hyena. "Ha ha ha, yeah, princess, I just did." That boy was fucking crazy. He was skinny with a big Barriqua fro and a gap between his two front teeth, wearing Sergio Valente jeans, a tight yellow t-shirt saying, "Where's the beef?" and 3 gold chains. Tavi, her best friend from the block in Corona, Queens, whom she pretty much known was gay since they were 14. What other boy ran around the neighborhood in tiny orange gym shorts, a rainbow headband, and Mork from Orc suspenders singing at the top of his lungs, "Hey mister, have you got a dime? Mister, do you want to spend some time?" Yep, that was Octavio. Tavi boy, she called him. They did everything together. She showed Tavi some of her best moves, kind of like if she were Sheila E. in the new Glamorous Life video she was obsessed with, in that shiny tight coat, rocking her shoulders while she thrashed away on those drums. Sheila E. was her new idol. In her mind, she was Sheila E. She did have hair nearly as big as Sheila's, styled asymmetrically, and she thought she had Sheila's attitude. Yet Issy was not deluded. She did not think she was as beautiful or sexy as Sheila, even as she tried to make the most of what she had. Her large, bright eyes, smooth caramel skin, and fairly good curves. Even though she stood at only 5 feet 4 inches, and even if her nose was a little flatter, her forehead a little higher, and her lips a little thinner than she'd have liked, she did her best to distract away from those things with makeup, fashion, and attitude. In her neighborhood, she was well liked. She was, after all, the younger sister of Freddie Mendez, a big guy with swagger, who nearly made the farm team for the Mets, and who, frankly, had never much paid her the time of day. But lately, having just turned 25, working toward her dental hygienist certificate while watching all her friends get married and have kids, or not get married but still have kids, she'd started to wonder, what'll become of me? Will I be alone my whole life? She would then catalog in her head the good qualities she possessed. I'm a caring person, she thought. I have a good sense of humor. I can cook. I take excellent care of my teeth. I don't take things too sensitively. I can go with the flow. Putting this list together in her head helped her, and she would always top it off with a prayer that she'd meet the right man for her before she turned 28. The previous cutoff had been 25, until she turned 25. Sometimes, often strangely in church, when she imagined she was supposed to be feeling her best, she would get deep pinpricks in her stomach that all was not right with the world, and that her usual daily belief that people were good and everything was as it should be was, well, a sham. She would think about how her father and brother held sway over the household, how she'd heard the words bitch and puta from them and other men, including her uncles and cousins, since she was a little girl, before she even knew what the words meant. She'd think about all the love children in the family and the neighborhood, about men who got off with impunity, and she'd think about the beat-down, sullen, workaday indignance of her grandmother and her mother and so many older women she knew, and how those women seemed to take it out on one another in the form of backstabbing and gossip, and she would suddenly feel not so great, or that the real answers were not to be found here in church, listening to this old, light-skinned Dominican priest drone on about rejecting the glamour of Satan. And she would seriously wonder if there wasn't perhaps some other life out there for her that promised more than a dental hygienist certificate. Then, to herself, barely perceptibly, she would sigh and dismiss her own thoughts. But her head wasn't in that melancholy place tonight. She was just having fun, and oh my God, she felt amazing. Plus, these men were hot. Here was one coming up to her right now. The DJ had just changed the song. Baby, you make my love come down, the whole room shouted along with the singer. Oh, you make my love come down. And suddenly this guy, this big-assed, hairy-chested moreno with chains dripping over a mesh purple tank top, was bumping up against her. Hey baby, he mouthed over the music. He held up poppers to his nose, inhaled, then held the tube up to her nose. She'd been watching guys inhale them all on the dance floor all night, and she wondered what they did. So now she allowed herself a demure sniff. Suddenly, she was feeling deliciously woozy and clinging to the guy's neck while he stroked her breasts and buttocks. Her knees buckled in her leggings. She was going to go out of her mind if she didn't have sex soon, she thought. She hadn't had sex since, well, 2 years ago, that sort of bad incident at that party. That hadn't been what she was looking for. Even the first time, at 15, with Ricky Malandrino, it hadn't been what she was expecting either. It had hurt, and it was over before it even began. It hadn't seemed very romantic. And then Ricky not so much as even talking to her in the street after. That didn't feel too great. But this moment, wow. They were sort of swaying and grinding, and she was holding onto his neck for dear life, feeling like her whole body below was giving out under his big hands. Then, as she felt the breathless, scary swoon of the poppers fade away, he pulled back. He put a hand under her chin and smiled at her and kissed her gently on the lips. You're beautiful, he told her. Shut up, she laughed good-naturedly. You're just high. He lost his smile, got stern. No, baby, you are, he said. You gotta believe that. He kissed her once more, then slipped away, leaving her there, barely moving amid the dancers. Tavi, who'd witnessed the whole thing, sidled back over to her. Puta, he said, then cackled. She shoved him, pleased with herself. They kept on dancing, hours it seemed. At different times, other men came over to them, danced with them, did the bump and grind with Tavi. He came to this Paradise Garage Club a lot, and he knew a lot of guys here, and even sometimes with her. Ooh, now the DJ was playing Heartbeat. Ooh, she loved this song, that slow beat, heartbeat, you make me feel so weak. That's how she felt, weak from dancing and elation. She had her head up looking into the lighting system, her arms up over her heads. She felt sexy. Girl, this song is turning you out, Tavi shouted at her over the beat. She shoved him. You're so disgusting. Some guys came over and danced with them. Kisses and gropes went all around. One of the guys, Issy noted, was very darkly handsome, a Boricua probably, with a somewhat serious, non-effeminate air about him. He looked a bit nerdy in his large, square-frame glasses, which he repeatedly took off to wipe steam from the lenses. There he was, dancing along with the rest of the guys in his tight t-shirt and designer jeans and Nikes, a bit of gold around his neck, but he seemed a little uptight. Tavi introduced everyone over the music. She and the handsome, nerdy guy, who was how old? Not quite 30 yet, met eyes. He gave her a kind smile, not that kind of, hey girl, greeting she got from most of the queens here. He took a few steps toward her and kissed her cheek. I'm Hector, he said, over the music. I'm Isabel, she shouted back. Issy. How do you know Tavi? He asked. We grew up together in Corona, she shouted, since we were little kids. Hector nodded his understanding. He's crazy, he said. Issy laughed. I know, she screamed. He's crazy, it's true, but I love him. I do too. How do you know him, she asked. First from out in the clubs, but now we volunteer together at GMHC too on the phones. She knitted her brows in puzzlement. What's that? She asked. Gay Men's Health Crisis, Hector said. It's an AIDS organization. Oh, she frowned. Then a horrible thought struck her. She glanced over at Tavi. Is he okay? She asked Hector. Oh, I think so. As far as I know, I mean, the test for it isn't out yet. We're just trying to provide direct services because the health department isn't doing anything, which I should know because I work for them. Issy nodded gravely. She hoped Tavi was okay. Otherwise, she hadn't caught much of what Hector had said. He seemed so serious for a guy on the dance floor. He'd even fully stopped dancing for a moment. It's a terrible thing, she offered. He nodded and turned. Yep, you gotta be careful. Protect yourself. Tavi came over. What you bitches talking about? He shrieked. Issy shoved him lightly. Tobbs, you didn't tell me you do volunteer work for AIDS. Tavi looked briefly freaked out, like he hadn't wanted Hector to tell her. Then he cackled and threw his arm around Hector. Yeah, we're like fucking Florence Nightingale and Mother Teresa up in there. I'm like Lily Tomlin with her receptionist headset thing going. He did his Ernestine imitation with an overbite stretching out his face. He hip-checked Hector. This one's always recruiting queens for the cause. Hector shrugged. If we don't do it, nobody else will, he said. So serious, Issy thought again, yet very handsome. Could he loosen up and have fun? She took his hand, made him spin her. Come on, Poppy, no more heavy talk. You gotta shake it more. Ooh, what a pushy bitch, Tavi screamed in delight. You heard her, Hectorina. She needs you to bump her pussy. Hector smiled goofily and shrugged and obliged her and did the bump with her a little bit, before politely excusing himself and disappearing into the crowd. Suddenly alone in the spot where she danced with Hector, Issy felt briefly bereft. She momentarily lost her footing, reached out instinctively for someone to break her fall. And someone did. But it wasn't Tavi, as she expected. It was the hairy-chested, pillow-lipped Moreno in the purple mesh tank. Oh my God, thank you, she said, regaining her footing. I almost went down. I saw you, he laughed, showing a mouthful of very white teeth, which Issy noted approvingly. You were like, whoa! He did a funny impression of her tottering on her heels and reaching out wildly for support. Oh my God, she said. I'm so embarrassed. Don't be, he said. You're up in the club. Then the DJ put on a song she loved from a few years ago. I Want to Thank You. I want to thank you, Heavenly Father, went the lyrics, for shining your light on me. You sent me someone who really loves me, and not just my body. That song was a bit of a prayer for Issy. It was a dance song, but a mellow one, and she couldn't help but exclaim to the purple tank guy, I love this song! His eyes popped open in delight. I do too, he said. He took both her hands in his and led her into a bit of an old-fashioned hustle step, sending her twirling through the bridge of their two arms, then reeling her in close again until she could feel his moist chest hair against her cheek and smell his cologne, which reminded her of her older brothers. Here, their dancing stopped. She became more and more aware of the feel of his body against hers, the width of his shoulders, the taper down to his slim waist, the feel of his jeans against her leggings, the warmth of his breath in her ear. Dios mío, she said, surprising herself. Purple Tank laughed and took her chin between his thumb and index finger. You know how beautiful you are? He asked her. You told me that already, she protested. You're just high on whatever drugs you're on. I'm not on any drugs, he insisted. Well, okay, I took a Quaalude. She laughed triumphantly. See, you're just fucked up. But he held her chin in place and fixed his eyes on her. No, baby, he said. I think you're beautiful. Why is it so hard for you to believe that? Issy felt both touched and uncomfortable all at once. Why is it so hard for me to believe that? She asked herself, still rocking to the song in his arms. Maybe because this was something she'd never heard before, not from family or from girlfriends, and certainly not from boys. She was just, well, she just was. She didn't think she was a Thea, and she didn't think she was a beauty queen. She didn't give much thought to herself. She probably spent more time thinking about her abuela upstairs and what groceries she should pick up for her on the way home from dental school, or what she should fix her for dinner, than she did about herself. But now, she had to admit to herself, it was damn nice to have a handsome man looking her deeply in the eyes and telling her she was beautiful. Then she realized she'd forgotten something. You're gay, she said. I'm bisexual, he shrugged. I probably like women more than men, to tell you the truth. I just love the music and the vibe here. I love the crazy mix of people. It's a great club, she said. She certainly had to admit that. Tavi had been telling her for a year he'd take her, and tonight they finally made it. Speaking of that, where was Tavi? She glanced around, failing to see him nearby. Suddenly, she saw nobody she knew, even vaguely. Then, Purple Tank's lips were on hers. They felt unbelievably pillowy and insistent. Her throat constricted for a moment. This isn't right, she thought. But apparently Purple Tank sensed her unease, because he pressed his hands firmly into her lower back, and she felt herself give out beneath him. Just relax and enjoy it, baby, he whispered. It's okay. It's a holiday. This was true, she thought. She lost herself in their necking. She clung gratefully to the solidity of his upper body. It took a long time for it to happen, went the song, but I knew those nights I prayed that you would send me someone who's real and not someone for play. Issy desperately wanted someone like that, she thought. She remembered Freddie just last week, rubbing his hand over the belly of her pregnant sister-in-law, Vanessa, and how her brother, usually so full of bravado and bluff, had a tender, almost reverent look in his eyes. She wanted a man to look at her like that. Maybe it was this man, she thought, and how funny that for the rest of her life she'd tell people that she met the man of her dreams in a gay club. She got so caught up in this reverie that she at first didn't notice that Purple Tank was leading her off the dance floor. She opened her eyes, feeling deliciously sleepy and removed from her body, and pulled him back. "Where are we going?" she asked. "Let's get some air outside, baby," he said. He sheltered her in his arms and guided her toward the exit. "Just let me tell Tavi," she said, straining to be heard over the music. "Tavi," he called back to her. She couldn't quite make out what he was saying. She stood up on tiptoes and scanned the crowd, much of which had divided into couples who were slow dancing, just as she had been minutes ago. She couldn't see Tavi. Well, she thought, a few minutes of fresh air wouldn't be so bad. There was a crowd smoking and laughing outside the club, amid a cool and lovely July night, boasting a sky where even a few stars westward toward the Hudson River were visible. Still feeling sparkly from the MDMA, Issy reveled in the breeze on her neck and arms. Purple Tank put his arm back around her and led her away from the crowd down the street. "Let's sit in my car," he said. "It's around the corner." "I don't even know your name," she said, dragging back a little bit. He turned. "Oh, I didn't tell you? It's Chris. Your friend Tavi and I see each other out all the time." Oh, Issy thought, so he knew Tavi. That gave her some reassurance. "And what's your name?" "It's Isabel," she said, "but just Issy." "That was my abuela's name," he said. Issy put her hands on her hips. "You are too much," she laughed. "I'm not fucking with you," he said, laughing along. "I can show you pictures." She stood there a moment longer, regarding him. "You are too much," she said again, moving back toward him. He put his arm back around her. His car, around the corner, was a powder blue Ford Fairmont, with a plastic pendant of San Cristobal hanging from the rearview mirror. "Oh, now I get the name," Issy said when she saw it. "Cristobal. That's right," he laughed. "El Santo de los Viajeros." They sat in the back seat with the windows open to let in the breeze. The street, in an industrial part of town deserted at night, save for the club, was still and silent. She closed her eyes, tilted back her head. In an instant she could feel those lips back on her own. She curled in toward him until she'd thrown her legs over his. She felt one of his meaty hands, so hairy, slip between the lower buttons of her untucked, oversized shirt with the pink and yellow graffiti print on it. Then she felt two of his fingers slip underneath her bra. At that moment, she surprised herself again with an eruption of tears. The saint of travelers pulled back a moment. "Why are you crying, baby?" "I don't know," she said, and she truly didn't. She vaguely remembered Tavi telling her that the MDMA would make her feel all emotional and open, that shrinks used it to get patients to open up about their feelings. "I just feel really happy. It's been a great night." He laughed. "It is a great night," he said, "because we met." Her blouse and bra were coming off, her leggings were coming off. The saint of travelers certainly appeared to be truly bisexual, she noted, impressed. As he penetrated her, as she sank deeper and deeper into the cushions of the back seat, she drew her arms more tightly around San Cristobal's neck, letting everything fall away with the power of their conjoined bodies. Eventually, as their rhythms intensified, she felt the stirrings of a massive inner thrill. She was going to have her first orgasm with a man. She was so overwhelmed by the sensations racking her. She thought it would never actually happen. It would just build and build. But then when it finally did, she thought it would never end. Amid that, San Cristobal himself came, deep inside her. They held each other, saying nothing, just breathing and shaking, until the sky changed from black to a deep blue. San Cristobal finally sat up, unceremoniously, disentangled himself, and fished a cigarette from a compartment near the front seat. "You want one?" he asked her. She was a little disappointed these were his first words after sex. They were hardly very romantic. That's okay, she said. I don't smoke. It's bad for your teeth. She began to pull her clothes back on. I brush and floss, he said, blowing smoke out the window. He was now sitting a foot or so away from her. He put his free left hand on the back of her neck as a half-hearted concession to intimacy. Issy didn't want the moment to end, though. She lay down again, resting her head on her thigh. I can't believe we have to go in there again, and I gotta find Tavi, she said. Yeah, he said hesitantly. Then, after a pause, actually, I think I'm gonna just be getting home now that I'm out of the club. I made some plans for today. You'll be okay getting back in yourself. This crushed her, deepening the cheap feeling that the oozy MDMA couldn't quite override. Of course I will, she managed to say. Don't worry about it. No, I didn't mean it as a question, he said. I meant, I knew you'd be okay getting back in because the guys at the door are cool. I know them. Double crushed. He didn't even sound mean about it, Issy thought, just a matter of fact, as though he genuinely wanted to clarify his intent. No, she said. I know how you meant it. At this point, she made herself sit up, then check and fix her hair in the rearview mirror. Everything she saw, the streets and the buildings and the passing cabs, looked sparkly and extra sharp from the MDMA, all of which made for a strange counterpoint to the core of badness she was suddenly feeling. Well, she turned to him. Goodbye. This, she thought, was the moment of truth. Please, she thought, trying not to betray herself with her eyes, ask me for a phone number or something. Goodbye, baby. He took a final drag off his cigarette, flicked it out the window, and leaned over to kiss her dutifully on the lips. Get back in there safe, okay? The final crush. She could feel tears welling in her eyes, so she turned quickly and stepped out of the car. She made a point of not looking back as she walked toward the corner of Hudson and King Streets. She would just go inside and find Tavi and forget that had ever happened. She was approaching the rather forbidding-looking bouncer, a muscular black man with a yellow mohawk, to ask politely if she could re-enter the club, when Tavi's handsome, nerdy friend walked out. Issy, he called to her. He remembered her name, and she felt bad for having forgotten his. Are you waiting for Tavi? She wondered if he could tell how disoriented and jangled she felt between the lingering druggy feeling and the prior moment's encounter. Huh? She asked. Oh, well, I'm going back in to find Tavia. I needed to get some air. He peered more closely at her behind his glasses. You okay? I'm fine, she said. I just really needed some air. He studied her a moment longer. Well, come on, he finally said, putting an arm around her. I'll go back in and help you find him. But you were leaving, right? It'll only take a minute. Besides, there's a guy I met whose number I should try to get. A little blonde kid. Oh boy, Issy managed to say. Well, okay then, thanks. The bouncer, who'd witnessed this exchange, brushed them back inside. Issy couldn't believe how crowded the club still was, even though it was now early morning. She'd certainly had enough for tonight, though. The DJ was playing something instrumental, heavy on African-sounding drums and a weird sort of flying saucer sound. The nerdy guy reached back for her hand, which she offered as they navigated themselves through the dancers. She pulled him back toward her for a moment. What's your name again? She shouted. Hector, he shouted back. Hector Villanueva. Thank you, Hector, she said. You're sweet. This was enough somehow to trigger a runaway tear. All she really wanted was a sweet guy, she thought. Why was it so hard to find one? Hector put his hands on her shoulders. What's wrong? He asked. It's just been a crazy night. Well, don't worry, he said. We'll get you to Tavi now, and then you can go home. He gave her an awkward little hug, as though to reassure her. Issy hugged him back, and found it hard to let go. Thank you. Thanks.
Tim, I'd love to kind of start out, I guess, maybe with a discussion a little bit about.
Can I come down and sit with you
Sure.
guys? Because it's like, I just wasn't seeing a big blur. Okay. Hey. Who lent me the book?
I think our
Oh,
staff
okay.
did.
Stop here?
Yes.
Okay. Alright. I'll sit here. What about I sit right, can I sit right here?
Do it.
Or like, I don't know. Try to make like a little knitting circle situation.
So
also like real kind of like phenomenons of the city, gentrification and things like that. So what are your, I guess starting with that scene of the early 80s, like what's your experience with that in New York? Like, is that your place? Were you there?
Right, was I there? No. Well, I moved to the. I mean, how old do I look, Chelsea?
I was there.
I know, and I love that. I love, I moved to the city in '91.
Okay.
Right out of college, a week out of college, and I've really never lived, except for stints here and there. I've really never lived elsewhere. So the '90s sections of the book, the sections from the early '90s on, I have a very vivid personal memory of, and my own personal visuals, and I have always been obsessed with New York in the 80s and 70s and 60s. I always say that the best birthday gift anyone could give me was to send me back in time. If I could pick one weekend, and then the game is, well, what year would it be, and where would I go, and etc. The Stone, well, that would be amazing. Yeah, the Stone, which, and you're gonna die. I was born on Stonewall. I was born on June 27th, 1969. So I'm a true baby of the revolution. I was breaching, and the heels were being thrown. Anyway, too much. Sorry.
What to go back to?
Yeah, well, I never know. I mean, it always seems to sort of somewhere around, like, I don't know why 1974 is. There was one club, I don't know if anyone remembers it was called The Loft. It was down somewhere in Soho or kind of around here, and well, anyway, we don't have to go into all that. But yeah, it was the early mid-70s. Yeah, and it was sort of like where hippie started morphing into disco, like hippie and funk kind of. So I've always been really, but there are many moments I would love to, So anyway, so for the sections of the book that are set in the 80s was really fun because I just immersed myself in, what's the word, trivialia, or whatever, I can't do the exact word, but I would just read old articles and look at old pictures and like look at any old video I could find and listen to old music. And of course I have friends older than me, so a lot of the book is, because again, moving here in '91, I missed the, I always say that AIDS-wise, I wasn't that generation of gay men that was, got, smacked in the face in the 80s. I was more like the next one, the generation that moved here in fear, like the real cloud of fear hanging over the city, but it did exist already, so it wasn't like we didn't know what was. So, it's just talking to friends, friends who were here in the 80s, and, where they went, and, what the city was like, and so I really just immersed myself in whatever I could find from that period.
And then what about the Christodora, which is, of course, the name of the book, but is also a place, a real place, that serves as kind of like a turning point to what's happening in the book, although of course it's about so much more than that. So why that place?
Well, it's so funny. I mean, some of you probably know that, the Christodora was a dump, right? It was a dump for many years, and then it went condo in the 80s, and that was sort of the, the beginning of gentrification and the Lower East Side, which by then had been, rebranded to East Village, and, the Tompkins Square Park crowd, that, the homeless and the denizens of the neighborhood turned on the building one night, and they stormed the lobby. They didn't get past the lobby, but chanting like "Die Yuppie Scum." So the building. That was 1988. That was the summer of 1988. That was the summer of the Tompkins Square Park riots. And one night they turned on the Christodora, and so that is, for those of you who read the book, that's the very opening pages. But interestingly, or one hopes, the book wasn't, when I started it, it wasn't set there. It was actually set in a very similar nearby building where like a friend of mine lives. Also a very old building, one of the few big buildings in the East Village with like a doorman and stuff. And that's kind of where I visualized it for the first several chapters. And then at some point, I kind of knew, this backstory about the Christodora that I just shared. It was always back there somewhere, and then someone kind of brought it up one night, because I was a third of the way through the book, and it was winter, and I was living in the neighborhood at the time, because I lived in the neighborhood for about 6 years, between Chelsea and Brooklyn. And I walked past the park. I walked up Avenue A, and it was winter, and everything was white and snowy, and I really kind of saw the building for the first time, and I saw how it kind of loomed over the neighborhood. It was the only tall building on the park, and as I'm sure if you've seen it, it's a very plain building. It's not the Dakota, or there's something very stalwart and like kind of WPA era about it, and but I just noticed how it sort of, and I thought, how amazing that bulky behemoth was sort of like sat there like all those decades, through like it opened in optimism in the 30s. It was affordable housing, and then it sort of like sank into total degradation, and like the city itself for so long, and then it made this comeback, and now it's obscenely wealthy. It's a symbol of extreme wealth, like so much of the city. And so that was the moment when I just love the name. I think it's the most beautiful name, because I think it sounds like a Rossetti poem, like a pre-Raphaelite poem, or like the name of a ship. Like there's just something very romantic and mysterious about it. And so then I kind of recast the book there, and the early pages became, when I went back and revised, the early pages actually became about the building.
So opened in the 30s as affordable housing?
It opened in 1929. Well, Christodora is a settlement house, a nonprofit that still exists, and in fact they are now like a fresh air fund thing. And if you Google Christodora, I feel like it's now my book competes with all these pictures of these adorable city kids learning nature stuff upstate, because that's what they do. But it was a settlement house like many settlement houses, and they built this building for its offices and for its social and work spaces, but they also built it as middle income housing. And it opened in 1929. And yes, and actually when the book came out last year, I met a woman who said that her parents met in the building. Isn't that beautiful? Her parents were both living in the building. Well, they weren't her parents yet, but they were both living in the building in the 40s or the 50s before its decline, and that's where they met. So it's a very sweet moment.
And how did you get the whole Hispanic culture done so well?
Well, I don't really know if I do. I mean, I just think it's friends, I just feel like that night is, so many nights. I don't really go clubbing a lot anymore, but I feel like that night, the spirit of it is like so many nights out that I had with friends, and some of those friends, especially the ones like the Puerto Rican and Dominican ones who grew up here, I asked to read the pages, as I was writing, and just be like, just tell me if anything is really off or whatever, So it's great. I think it's so important to have readers,
Did you get any margin notes that were like, this is too, you're right?
Well, I think with one friend, like with Isabel, there was an earlier iteration of her, and I think one friend said, in kind of her inner monologue, and said like, I think I'm getting a little too much you here,
yeah.
And maybe the friend said that because he knows me so well.
Right.
But that was sort of like a flag, and I mean, I think with characters in general, it's that balance, like you're always on some level drawing from yourself, because if it's a particular strain of experience, in the character that like you're pulling, you really only have your own personal experience, but then, I feel like you also really do have to, I'm a journalist too, so I feel like I really love, and also Isabel is based, I've interviewed so many women with HIV/AIDS in the past 20 years, and so survivors, obviously. Well, some have since died, but because for the most part, it was in the era of effective treatment. Most of them are still alive. But I've heard so many stories from women about really being blindsided by it and finding out and feeling extremely isolated and extremely ashamed and living in secrecy with it, and then eventually, obviously the fact that they were talking to me for a story, they had come out, and they became very powerful. Often they became very powerful activists, like like Yissy does, So that's I lost my. I don't need to do anything today. I don't sound too sick.
That's one thing that I really enjoyed about reading it was that section of both learning about the AIDS activism, which I knew activism, which I just combined activism and activism. That's fun. Learning about that, but also learning in particular about women's role in that whole fight, which was just so interesting because I hadn't really considered the intersection of those two things. But of course, there was this feeling that they were sort of isolated and sort of sidelined in the discussion about their symptoms and their treatment, and so that was
They were
really
literally not counted by the government, maybe they were counted as people with it, but they were not, their symptoms, their issues, their funding, their specific medical needs and funding needs were not counted separately until they made it happen.
Right.
And they really did, and it's amazing. To me, it's so, I got arrested once in the past month in DC, occupying a Republican senators' offices, trying to stop the evil Republican health bill. I'm sorry, I assume that, I'm pretty safe. Yes, it was wonderful. Tory Johnson, absolutely. Well, but not the same day, but in part of the same way, multiple ways. And it was really funny because I think a lot of people feel as though, people's health care and health coverage in particular has not been as dire since that era as it was in this moment, when it looked like over 24 million people could lose their health coverage. And so, it was and a lot of the people involved in the current activism are a lot of the veterans of ACT UP and of AIDS activism, the golden age or the dark age or whatever you want to call it. So it's crazy. It's dispiriting to, this fight really never ends, in America. It never ends. It's just, shameful. And yet, there's another, and I really, really try to reflect this in the book. There's a really exhilarating side of activism as well, where you find your power and you find your family, you find your comrades, and I really wanted to, and there's a price that that people pay for years of activism under such dire circumstances. So I really wanted to try to capture all of that, because I feel like I know so many people who are survivors of that era.
So when you got arrested, they put you in jail for one night and released you?
No, it wasn't even for a night. It's actually very, it's a civil disobedience action, so it's kind of like, and particularly if you're doing it in a place where they happen a lot, like New York or DC, the activists and the cops are kind of on the same page. Everyone knows how it's going to. Yeah, you don't resist arrest. You might make your body go limp and they carry you out because that's a better visual for the media, but you don't actually resist arrest, so it all remains. It's mostly just very tedious. But what was really moving about doing it.
So they take you to the cop shop, they do paperwork, and then release you?
You sit there in cuffs, in plastic cuffs,
Plastic
with all your comrades, And it took, when I did it, I think 85 of us were arrested. This was about 3 weeks ago.
Yeah.
It took 7 hours for them to process all of us.
Right.
So we actually got on a bus. For those of us coming from New York, it was amazing because there were people coming from all around the country, and particularly the states that are the most, with the senators who really mattered, the swing states and a lot of red states. And a lot of those people have disabilities, and they came in wheelchairs and with IV bags, and it was eerily reminiscent of pictures that I've seen, because I didn't really partake of AIDS activism in that late 80s, early 90s. I was in college. But it was eerily reminiscent of pictures I've seen, where you had like people with their carrying their drips, as they were being arrested. So it's really
So
crazy.
how has, you came in the 80s, right? So, you wish you would have come 20 years earlier. How about like people who came 20 years later? Like how has their perception changed and their attitude that you talked about it?
About the city?
Yeah, and that whole, the whole entertainment and the
Right.
activism and all that.
So you're saying people that came in the 2000s?
Yeah, millennials.
Well, I mean, I think nostalgia is that, it's a cyclical, anyone who's been here for 10 years or more thinks it was better even just 10 years ago, let alone for me 25 years ago, 30, 35 years ago. I don't think that, I can only imagine that, if you were moving here, especially if you were queer, right, or and if you were moving here from a small town somewhere, I can't imagine that it would, moving here in recent years or even going forward, would be any less exhilarating than it was. What about, how old are you? You look young. 28. What's your name again?
Matt.
Where are you from, Matt?
I'm actually from the suburbs of New Jersey.
Okay, well, can you speak to this at all?
I mean, I actually also very highly involved with the LGBT 20-somethings group at the center.
Oh,
so
okay.
I can speak to this. It's interesting, on one hand, having worked at GBSHP and all the stories of LGBT activism, AIDS activism, just how it fits into the neighborhood. Most people that are my age that are moving to the cities from elsewhere are coming here because they're trying to, establish a new life and a new queer identity for themselves. But unfortunately, when it comes to discussions of gentrification, when it comes to discussions of neighborhood identity, there's that disconnect of, well, they know the neighborhood is known for all of these things. They just don't know the history, they don't know the story of it. And in a sense, based on just education and where they come from, they might not even know, there's not a sense of, okay, there's, how I put it, the struggles that they're more concerned with are different than, maybe back in the 90s, it was more talking about the AIDS and HIV. Nowadays, are more of the discussions focused on bullying and just legislation that protects people from discrimination.
Transgender issues.
Very much so. Working with youth, working with queer trans people of color. And then occasionally the PrEP conversation comes up. And that's a big one, but that also, on one hand, it's opened up a new conversation concerning HIV/AIDS, but it's also sidelined the conversations on HIV/AIDS.
Yes, and we should just say PrEP is the HIV prevention pill that's become very prevalent in recent years.
But in terms of, the party scene, in the 80s and even before, it was much more, liberal or more extreme, I suppose. Not party that much anymore. But, it was, now everything is a lot more expensive in those days. People had huge lofts, and they lived there legally or illegally, and somebody got, a bunch of beer cases, and somebody else was playing in,
But something, that just moved to Brooklyn.
Yeah.
Because I've been to crazy parties, and of course I was the grandpa in the crowd, but I've been to wonderful bohemian crazy parties in Brooklyn, in the warehouses of Bushwick or wherever, where you have drag and performance art, and it just left Manhattan, I think, is really, and it probably, with every passing day, that's less affordable for them to do in Brooklyn. But I think that, I think youth culture, it goes on, it prevails, right? It's all about finding a space, cheap space to have that.
Even in Brooklyn, Prime Williamsburg no longer has a gay bar, and that's getting pushed outward to East Williamsburg.
What, Metropolitan's closing?
No, this and that closed last year.
Oh, okay.
Macri Park's still opened up, Metropolitan's still there, now there's Rosemont, but
Right.
South Brooklyn, there's a lot of turnover depending on how the neighborhood has been changing. And even here in the East Village, East Eastern Bloc is closing to make way for Club Cumming. That's the location that they chose for it.
What's Club Coming?
Alan Cummings.
Oh, he's
corporate.
opening a. Wow, really?
Yeah.
What, like a
it's,
cabaret?
it's,
People mistake
yeah,
it for
it's
Alan
something
Cummings,
like
don't
that.
They do all the time, yeah.
But it's strange
But not
because
vice versa.
you
I guess
have
he's more
this
famous than me.
bar that is
What's the address? Where is
It's on 6th Street between Avenue A and B.
But that's funny because he's been going to Eastern Bloc for years.
Yeah, and this
So he must have a
bar
real
is one of
attachment to
the
the
last
space.
holdovers that like it's grittier, it's more what you think East Village, and now it's probably going to become more of a sanitized experience.
But you know, I would push back on, what's your name again?
Matt.
Now, you know, I push back a little bit. I mean, the boiler room is still there. I mean, that is a miraculous to me. The boiler room's a real long time, real gritty, you know, gay, rock and roll type, you know, bar. And I mean, it's true, we've lost a lot, you know, but I mean, I still think, the East Village in particular retains a lot of its character that I remember from the early 90s. I mean, I know that rents are a fortune, but I think commercially, because all the spaces are such tiny little boxes, it doesn't lend itself as easily to like Chelsea, that everything's becoming a bank or like a Dwayne Reed.
Well, that's also one of our current initiatives, trying to get a zoning for a special East Village business district. Because with the Starbucks moving in on St. Mark's.
Yes.
I'm really good at is one thing I think is interesting is talking about kind of the types of businesses that remain, and there was in the 80s and 90s, and of course there are still today, all of these sort of havens of LGBT culture where you can really go and be yourself. And outside maybe you can't so much, but in places like you described in the chapter you just read, you can really let loose and be yourself. And one thing that I have read a lot of people talk about as far as some of these places closing down is that for many different reasons those places aren't as necessary anymore in the culture, because it's more accepted to sort of be like acting gay in a normal bar. And so you maybe don't need those anymore, and that's not, you know, necessarily a good thing that those places are dispersing. But I've heard that before. I don't know what's your sort of take on that?
I think it's both true and not true.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, I do think that. I mean, you know, actually, I really have to recognize an incredible documentary coming out that I just saw last night called The Death and Life of Marsha P. Johnson. Marsha P. Johnson was a very pioneering trans activist. You know, she and Sylvia Rivera started the first trans rights group in 1972 or 3. And this documentary is just remarkable. The footage, I mean, just the effort of the footage.
Where did you see it? Where is it?
Well, I saw it like a media screener, but it's coming out in the fall. And it'll be on Netflix as well. But it is the footage of this queer life, especially around the Village in New York. There's a little footage of Stonewall, extremely rare, black and white, no audio, but particularly in the 70s, 80s, and 90s is incredible. And oh yeah, to your point, you know, the city was extremely dangerous for queer people then. So there really was the sense of it when you were in a bar, like you were in a safe zone, you know, and even walking home from the bar. I mean, I even remember that in Chelsea in the very early 90s, there was always this sort of background feeling of unsafety.
And the kids used to drive in from Jersey. I lived on Baker Street for many years.
Gay bashing, I mean, it was just
and
part of life.
One of my girlfriend's neighbors to go get ice cream, and the kids were from Jersey were walking home eating ice cream, and they're like yelling at us, we lesbians, blah, 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 blah. And they would like come into the city just to gay bash.
Right. And I think that for middle class, central, gay people, you know, especially clustered around like Manhattan and kind of inner Brooklyn, that's really dissipated. But that's still a real issue. If you're like a, you know, black trans girl in the Bronx, I mean, there can still be very hostile places to live and to navigate. But I just really can't recommend this. And it's also I hate to even cheapen it by saying this, but it's also like a whodunit, you know. I think she died in '92. They found her body in the Hudson, and it was just written off by the cops as a suicide. but everyone at the time was fairly certain that it wasn't, and it does delve into that. But it doesn't do it in a cheap way. It does it in the context of like the vulnerability of like these transgender lives, and that hasn't changed. I mean, it's just so wonderful. I just saw it last night, so I really have to keep an eye out for it. It's really great.
Still alive?
I'm sorry?
Is Sylvia still alive?
No, Sylvia died in 2002.
Is there a street named after her?
She has an honorific on one of the streets. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I just have to say, and a lot of it is about Sylvia, and it's just remarkable. I mean, it really is not. It is also the story of the city, you know, and the. Yeah, it's really just incredible.
For me, there were two things that really brought me into it. One was the vulnerability of all the characters. So I related to a lot of characters from different angles. It was interesting how you tossed the ball around chapter to chapter. I really had to ground myself each time to figure out where is this, what happened, where in the sequence.
Yeah.
But it was a very tender way of describing these people. And the other thing is, I'm a social worker. Worked in village care, did internship
Oh, wow.
in village care, more recently than that. But that you kept going back to the idea that the city agency fell short, even though the woman running it couldn't have been more passionate and more dedicated
Yeah.
and open to it. But the resources were incongruous with what she knew she needed.
Well, and I also
And
think the mayor at the time didn't want to deal with it because he was gay, because he was a closeted homosexual. I mean, that was a huge part of the problem with that was a huge part of the problem with AIDS in New York in the 80s.
But it's common in agencies for the workers to know what they need and not be able to, not have those resources and
Yeah.
not be able to put simply two and two together.
Yeah.
When Joyce Lynn-Elders was the Surgeon General in Arkansas, if you read her book, she went around agency to agency. The issue was teenage pregnancy. And she simply asked the workers, what do you need? She gave it to them because she was the one in charge. And they wiped out teenage pregnancy. Clinton was governor of Arkansas, and she wasn't Surgeon General, she was the head.
Yes. And how horrible that, well,
But
there's
it's not
nobody the
common.
Clintons won't throw under the bus. You know,
But
don't
it's
get me
not-
started.
It doesn't.
They threw her under the bus.
So
for
you
because
kept
for
highlighting
condoms,
that.
you know, because she promoted condoms in the 90s, and remember? Do you remember that? They sacked her. You know, she was she was the Surgeon General under Bill Clinton. Yeah, wonderful woman, and they sacked her for being very frank about sex ed and HIV and condoms. You know.
Who else has got a question? How many people here have read it? So, I know you have. Alright,
Well, thank you guys. I'm so
Thank
honored.
you. Yeah.
Of course, of course. Do you all live in the villages?
Artemis Village.
East, west,
Village.
all village here. Yeah. What about where do you live, Mark? Matt, I'm sorry. I haven't eaten. I'm not usually this space. You live in Brooklyn?
Yeah.
We all live in Brooklyn, all us kids, right? Where in Brooklyn?
Hubbleville, actually.
Oh, that's kind of fancy.
Yeah.
Brooklyn's fancy.
Yeah.
Well, it's like the West Village, only without all the gay bars.
Yeah. Right. You know, it's so funny about Brooklyn because you know, when I moved here in '91, you know, to live in Brooklyn there was no greater shame, you know, than if you had to live in Brooklyn, you know.
Well,
And
in the book, Millie, like, she moves away, she like moves to Brooklyn for like, when they break up,
she
right?
does move to
She, like,
Brooklyn
really
for a
quickly.
little while,
It's
right?
like, I
Yeah.
have to get out, I guess I'm gonna have to go to Brooklyn.
Yeah, right, because you could afford your own apartment.
Right.
You really, you know, in Brooklyn. But
Well, my parents
she
lived
was
at
there.
nights when they moved to the Jersey suburbs.
oh,
Back
really?
when they were living in the Upper West Side in the 80s, they were terrified of the outer boroughs.
Oh,
They're
yeah.
still to a degree. And my dad's from Queens, and he still warns all my brothers and me, like, don't go to Brooklyn, don't go to Queens. Don't go to
Right,
Queens.
right.
Of course he moves to Brooklyn.
Yeah.
Right, totally. The place everyone's grandparents were trying to get
Yes,
out of,
that's
right?
exactly right.
I took that as a metaphor, that Millie was she was so hurt and so feeling so much that she could take herself out of the mainstream.
Oh, interesting. I never thought
She
of
left
that.
where the action is.
Yeah, I never thought of that. I was actually thinking of a certain friend who got, you know, she's based on a few people, but this friend in particular who moved to Cobble Hills. And of course, so
We went to the Far East Village, Barrow Street in 1980.
what was considered the Far East Village?
Far west.
Oh,
No,
Barrow
Barrow
Street. Oh, okay.
1980, when
Wow.
the prison barge was on the river.
Wow.
Wow.
Well, the footage of the piers, the piers and the river play a big role in this documentary that I watched, and the footage of the piers at that time is haunting. I mean, this is just a haunting documentary. I hope you all see it. It's really, it's called The Death and Life of Marsha P. Johnson. Originally it was called Marsha and Sylvia, you know, but they sort of just but a lot of it is about Sylvia, and it's just so amazing. I
Were
mean,
they
it's just-
a couple?
no, they were just very good friends, and they were like kind of sister comrades, you know,
Yes.
trans activists, yeah. And it's really great. Well, I just want to thank you all so much. I'm so honored. And please, if you have liked the book, or if you like the book, whether you go on the tweet book or the face tweet or instant face or whatever, maybe put a little thing on there, or even if you don't do that, just please tell your friends about it and help me keep word of it alive, because you know, it's one of those little chug books, you know, like if they didn't have the money to you know, spend like, you know, whatever on it, but you know,
Parade down Fifth Avenue or anything.
no, Parade down Fifth Avenue. Of course.
But I read the whole thing.
Yeah, it is a fat book, isn't it?
No, I'm
Yeah. My new one is even bigger.
What's your